I'm so appreciative for the ritual of yahrzeit, but I also find it complicated, even stress-inducing. The Syrian custom of prioritizing Kaddish from the Friday beforehand is challenging, especially for someone like me who gets a bit antsy in shul. I think with a smile that my father somehow made sure that his family would always end up in shul on Shabbat Chanukah, the Shabbat with potentially the longest tefillah of the year. My father never seemed to find shul arduous. He was punctilious about getting there on time, never ate beforehand until chemo made that impossible, and would sit wrapped in his talit, wholly absorbed in his prayers, with his eyes closed, but glancing up now and again to make sure that everything was proceeding with the decorum that he strongly felt was warranted by tefillah. More substantively, as each yahrzeit rolls around, these notes are titled Yahrzeit number 9. I wonder how yahrzeit is meant to be distinctive from every other day. We miss my father and feel surrounded by him all the time. The absence of my father has already become its own presence that fills our lives. We stumble across my father's papers and books and his little love notes to us with his terrible handwriting. We feel some guilt cooking salmon in the house because he disliked fish passionately and made my mother cook it outside on the grill. We talk about him with our children. I look at each of my siblings and see such strong traces of him in them, and we ask ourselves frequently, what would Daddy do? When we see something funny that my father would have appreciated, we send it out to the family chat, imagining our father's laughter in response. Sometimes it feels like there's not much more to say on these yahrzeits. This is the 9th yahrzeit, and for me, the yahrzeit is an opportunity to specifically think about what the person we've lost stood for, what they've left behind, and the ways we seek to carry on who they were. Towards the end of his life, and actually throughout his life, my father would sometimes wonder out loud, what have I actually accomplished? Did I make an impact? He would worry. I didn't build any institutions or movements or make any intellectual breakthroughs. It was heartbreaking to hear him say that. So on his yahrzeit, I like thinking about the places where I believe my father did leave an impression, the places where I see his legacy in our own family, and I hope more broadly as well. My father loved the biblical phrase, kol demama daka, the small, still voice, which was where Hashem revealed himself to Eliyahu Hanavi. Hashem was not in the wildfire or in the rapturous wind, but in something profoundly calm, quiet, maybe even sweet. Eliyahu, however, does not get the message that this is where to find God. And God asks Eliyahu to turn the mantle of leadership, literally and figuratively, over to Elisha, his servant. Who is Elisha? When Eliyahu summons Elisha, Elisha asks, before I go with you, can I kiss my mother and father goodbye? I once learned with my father that that gesture represents the small, still voice that the zealous Eliyahu simply could not comprehend. On that note, I want to point to a few places when it came to interpersonal skills. Small, still, nothing earth-shattering, where I think my father made his mark. This might come as a surprise, but by nature, our father was actually a private person and had to work hard, especially in the early years of his rabbinate, to overcome what I think was some innate shyness. In time, my father truly enjoyed talking, schmoozing, and appreciating each and every person he met and who came through the shul. He valued friends and friendship. So many people told us after he died, your father wasn't only my rabbi, or he wasn't my rabbi at all, since I don't believe in anything. He was my friend. On that day in October of 1998, when my father was first diagnosed and immediately scheduled for surgery the following week, his friend Sammy found him working at my grandma Doris's house and said with his inimitable humor, Ezra, this is a fine mess you've gotten us into. This emphasis on the us reflected the degree to which Sammy, of course with Nancy, took on the burden and the challenge of my father's cancer. Sickness is lonely, but my father's friends, mother, sisters, brothers-in-law, nieces, and nephews surrounded him always, and especially during treatments, with love, care, and conversation, even as he fell asleep on them in the chemo chair. It was his childhood friend, Elliot, who, along with his duties as shul president, shepherded my father's PhD over the finish line. A mixed metaphor I think they would both appreciate. This was an act of deep generosity and friendship. Beyond his friends, my father cultivated relationships with a wide range of people, frequently using the medium of letter writing. Most significantly, we kids all got letters or faxes when we were away at camp, and he would buy us and my mother books, ranging from Alice in Wonderland to Isaac Bashevis Singer, to much stranger selections like the Oxford Book of Horror Stories from Barnes & Noble sales and the 25-cent rack at the Ocean Township Library, always inscribing them with funny, sweet notes. In fact, someone gave my father a wonderful book, Sefer HaAgadah, for his bar mitzvah, and my father took it upon himself to inscribe it from the gift giver to my brother. My father managed to connect through letters with people who were more famous than his beloved children. As a rabbinical student, my father wrote to the Jewish philosopher Eliezer Berkowitz, and even showed up unannounced on the Berkowitz's doorstep in Israel at the prompting of a family friend. My father was terrified, but Mrs. Berkowitz exclaimed, "Oh, you're the letter boy." And my father and mother had an extraordinarily memorable visit with them. He also wrote a letter to the celebrated neurosurgeon and author, Oliver Sacks, soon after my grandpa was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Amazingly enough, Oliver Sacks wrote back. Perhaps on a more transcendent level, I imagine my father's relationship with God as a friend. In Devarim it says, V'inyamin amar yedid Hashem yishkon lavetach alav, chofef alav kol hayom uven ktefav shachen. Of Binyamin he said, the friend of God shall dwell in safety by God. God covers Binyamin all the day and dwells between Binyamin's shoulders. This description of Binyamin feels like such an apt embodiment of who my father was. Throughout my father's life, God was such a steady and comforting companion. There was actually something simple about my father's faith, simple but not simplistic, a distinction I learned from him. I'll just close with a note about my father's relationship with my mother. Once my father was diagnosed, my mother became his caretaker, his liaison with doctors, his support in ways big and small. I don't look at them as heroes, since I know they would say there is no one way to go through sickness, either as a patient or as a caretaker. Rather, I look at them as an example of what it means to be an ultimate loving friend. A couple of nights before he died, as my father was getting weaker, I remember him sitting next to my mother and leaning his head on her shoulder as she put her arm around him. That's an image I will carry forever. My hope is that these memories inspire us in the chaotic, confusing, frenetic world we live in to make those phone calls, to write those letters sealed in an envelope. My father marveled at email, but could never quite grasp it, to reach out to people, to invest in friendships, to connect and make time for our children, siblings, spouses, and parents, and to find in God's companionship, comfort, and awe. May my father's memory always be for a blessing. Thank you.